You think you're running out of time? That's the first thing I noticed about you. Not the gray at your temples. Not the number that arrived on your last birthday like an uninvited guest who made himself comfortable and refused to leave. No, it's the look. That specific, unmistakable look people get when they've started doing the math. When they've begun, quietly, privately, in the shower at 6 a.m, tallying up the years spent and the years left, as if life were a balance sheet and someone had just audited it without warning. You've started to believe the story, haven't you? The one everyone agrees on without ever discussing. The one that says the first half of your life was the opening act, the energy, the potential, the promise, and everything from here is the long, slow curtain call. That the best you can do now is manage the decline with dignity. Maintain. Sustain. Taper gracefully towards something you never agreed to. I find that absolutely fascinating. Not because it's wrong, although it is. Spectacularly, provably wrong, but because of how thoroughly you believed it. Without evidence, without a single moment of actual interrogation, you just absorbed it. From a culture that worships at the altar of youth like a religion whose God keeps getting younger and whose congregation keeps getting older. And no one finds that funny. I find it funny. Because here is what nobody, not your doctor, not your family, not the glossy magazines with their eternal promises of anti-aging, nobody has told you. The second half of life doesn't diminish you. It distills you. And there is an enormous, terrifying, almost indecent difference between those two things. But we'll get there. Sit with the discomfort for a moment. You've earned it. Let me tell you where it started. Not with the number is just a symbol. It started long before that. It started the first time someone looked at a person older than you with a particular kind of sadness. A pity that was never spoken but always present, like furniture. You filed that away. Children always do. The brain is nothing if not efficient at cataloging threats. And so by the time your own threats, the 30, 40, 50, however precisely the calendar decided to aim its weapon at you, you had already been rehearsing the grief for years. You walked into it already carrying the eulogy, already half convinced that what was being mourned deserved to be mourned. Let me tell you what you actually think, not what you say you think. What lives in the quiet underneath the composure? You think the people who seem genuinely alive after 40 are performing. That they're working very hard at enthusiasm the way an aging actor works, very hard at being convincing. You watch them and you're not inspired, you're suspicious. Because if they're real, then the story you've been telling yourself is wrong. And that's somehow more frightening than the decline you've already accepted. Do you think your best ideas have already happened? Not consciously. You'd never say it out loud, but there's a hesitation now before you begin something new. A half-second pause that wasn't there before. A small, quiet voice that asks, "Is this worth starting?" And you've mistaken that voice for wisdom. It isn't wisdom. It's the scar tissue of a story you were told so many times it became load-bearing. You've started editing yourself. Not your work, yourself. The ambitions that seemed reasonable at 25 now feel slightly embarrassing at 45. You've started framing your desires in terms of what's still realistic, still appropriate. You've started apologizing preemptively for wanting too much, for taking up too much space in the future that supposedly belongs to someone younger. And here is the part that I genuinely find exquisite. In that specific way, that tragedy is exquisite. You are doing all of this at the exact moment in your life when you have finally accumulated everything you need to do something extraordinary. The clarity you have now, you bled for that, the judgment that lets you see which battles are worth having. That cost you something real. The relationships you've stopped tolerating, the nonsense you've developed an allergy to, the ability to distinguish between what actually matters and what was always just noise dressed in urgency, none of that was free. None of it arrived without cost. You paid for those tools with years of your life. And now, on the morning, you finally possess them. Sharp, tested, yours. You've decided the shop is closed. I once knew someone who went to extraordinary lengths every single night. Remarkable lengths, really. To help a city that was too distracted and too frightened to understand what it actually needed. And this person spent considerable energy trying to be everything for everyone. And a great deal more energy trying not to be known as anything in particular. The exhaustion that comes from that kind of arrangement is extraordinary. I mention it only because I see something similar in you. All this power, all this capacity, and a deep, sincere commitment to pretending you don't have it, because having it feels presumptuous at your age. The real question, the one you haven't asked yourself, the one sitting very patiently underneath all the acceptable questions is this. What if the life you think you're losing was never your actual life to begin with? What if everything before now was just the long, expensive, occasionally humiliating education, and the actual work, the real work, the work that will matter, hasn't started yet? That's not a comfortable question. Good. They gave you the word decline because it's tidy. It fits on a graph. It produces a clean downward curve that satisfies people who are more comfortable with predictable endings than complicated middles. Decline, as a concept, is extraordinarily convenient for people who are not you. It keeps you manageable, legible, scheduled, but look at what the word actually assumes. It assumes that whatever was at the top of the curve, the speed, the raw energy, the fearless ignorance of someone who doesn't know yet what they don't know, it assumes that was the peak. That is the assumption nobody examined. Because the things that increase in the second half of life are not things that show up on the graphs they showed you. They don't measure emotional precision, the ability to read a room, a relationship, a moment with an accuracy that takes decades to develop. They don't measure tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to hold contradictions without panic, to move forward without certainty, which is the only real condition under which anything important gets done. They don't measure the particular kind of courage that isn't recklessness. Not the courage of someone who doesn't know the risks, but the courage of someone who knows them completely and chooses anyway. Decline is what happens to machines. You are not a machine. You are something considerably stranger and more difficult to graph. The word you were looking for is not decline. The word is refinement, and refinement is not a lesser thing. It is what separates iron from steel. Here is where it comes from, and I want you to actually hear this, not nod along, and file it somewhere comfortable. Industrial society needed its workers young. Young bodies, quick reflexes, low wages, high compliance, and the sublime gift of not knowing enough to ask difficult questions. Youth was economically valuable, and so youth was culturally glorified. The glorification came first from usefulness, not from truth. It was a preference dressed as a fact. The market mead promoted to a philosophy the story that power peaks young and then retreats. That story was authored by people and systems that profit from your belief in your own obsolescence. It keeps the supply chain moving. It keeps the new generation anxious and the older generation quiet. It keeps everyone convinced that relevance has an expiration date stamped on it somewhere, and that the only dignified response to finding that date approaching is graceful withdrawal. What no one told you is that the people who actually changed things, who built something, who moved the needle, who left any kind of mark at all, most of them did it later. Not because they discovered some secret, but because they stopped believing in the expiration date. They looked at the story, found it unconvincing, and declined to star in it. The myth of peak youth is not wisdom. It is someone else's economic interest wearing the mask of inevitability. Now, let's talk about the people who remind you of your age. The ones who say it with that specific tone. That mixture of gentle concern and unmistakable satisfaction that passes for compassion in certain circles. Ask yourself what they're actually saying. When someone implies that your ambitions are slightly too large for your stage of life, that the things you want to build, create, become, are somehow age inappropriate, what are they really communicating? What does that judgment protect? In most cases, it protects them from having to examine their own retreat. Misery is famously impatient with anyone who refuses to join it. If your continued expansion is possible, then their resignation was a choice. And that particular truth is extremely unwelcome at dinner parties. There is a type of person. I've had the distinct pleas. You're of observing several? Who is deeply committed to the idea that noble effort must be accompanied by perfect invisibility, who insists that the highest form of service is the kind no one can trace back to you, who has decided that to be known is somehow to be diminished. I find that kind of thinking both poignant and revealing. It tells you more about the thinker's fear of being fully seen than it does about the nature of greatness. The people who police your ambitions are almost never people with no ambitions of their own. They are people who already gave theirs up and desperately need you to validate that the surrender was correct. Don't give them that. Not because they don't deserve kindness, they do, but because the kindness they're asking for is agreement, and agreement would cost you your life. Their judgment reveals their wound. It says nothing whatsoever about your ceiling. Let me be precise about this, because vague encouragement is the enemy of useful truth. The second half of life produces specific, measurable, replicable advantages that youth simply cannot manufacture. Not because youth is inferior. It has its own advantages, ones you had and used and frankly mostly wasted, as young people sensibly do. But there are things that only arrive with time. Pattern recognition. The ability to see within the first 90 seconds of a situation what this is, because you have been inside enough situations to have a reference library of human behavior that no amount of intelligence or enthusiasm can replace. Young brilliance sees clearly. Seasoned intelligence sees around corners. Risk calibration, not risk avoidance. Risk calibration, not risk avoidance. Risk calibration. The difference between someone who avoids all risk because they're afraid and someone who assesses risk with precision because they've watched enough things fail to understand exactly which failures are instructive and why, are just expensive. That is not caution. That is not caution. That is targeting relationship depth, the network of trust built over decades, not contacts. Not connections, but people who have watched you over time, survived difficult moments with you, and know what you're actually capable of. That network is not replaceable by any technology, energy level, or enthusiasm. It is built in the only currency that cannot be inflated. Time. These advantages do not arrive automatically. They arrive for people who stayed awake through the difficulty instead of numbing it. But if you did that, and you know whether you did, Then you were sitting on a stockpile of capacity that most of the world's most impressive young people would trade everything to have access to. That is not consolation. That is competitive advantage. Treated accordingly, everything I've described, the clarity, the pattern recognition, the earned judgment, the deep trust, all of it can be wasted. All of it can curdle. A sharp knife left in a drawer rusts. And the second half of life, for people who never reclaimed it, doesn't produce refinement. It produces bitterness. Bitterness is what clarity becomes when it's never applied. When all that hard-won seeing has nowhere to go, it turns inward and becomes corrosive. The person who could have been extraordinary becomes instead a very accurate, very detailed critic of everyone else's attempt to be extraordinary, which is its own kind of tragedy, and I don't say that without sympathy. It's just the tragedy I refuse to let you perform without pointing it out. The difference between the second half of life used and the second half of life wielded is the moment when you stop treating your history as a weight and start treating it as a weapon. Not for aggression, for precision. For precision, for the ability to strike at exactly the right thing, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right T-force and waste nothing. Someone in full possession of their second life doesn't look like someone trying to prove something. They look like someone who already knows. And that particular quality, that quiet, immovable certainty, is the most powerful thing a human being can project. Not because it intimidates, because it's real. The knife, held in panic, cuts everything, including the hand that holds it. The knife held with intent cuts only what it means to cut. The words you use inside your own skull are architecture. They determine the shape of every thought that follows. And the words most people are using about their age, the words absorbed quietly without ever noticing the absorption, are demolition words. They tear things down. They set ceilings where there should be open sky. Stop using still. As in, I'm still in good shape. I still have ambition. I can still learn. The word still carries inside it the assumption that you should no longer be these things, and that their persistence is a mild miracle requiring acknowledgement. Replace still with nothing. You are in good shape. You have ambition. You learn. Remove the apology built into the qualifier. Stop using for my age. You know the construction. Impressive for my age. Ambitious for my age. Strong for my age. This phrase performs humility, but actually performs something darker. It preemptively accepts a diminished standard and asks for credit within it. Replace it with nothing. Impressive. Ambitious. Strong. Replace running out of time with operating with precision. One suggests a chase you're losing. The other describes someone who has learned which things are worth running toward. The same circumstances. Entirely different orientation. The language you choose is not decoration. It is the first cause of everything that follows. Some looms were built to make you feel small. Not through hawes. Utility through architecture. The relationships, the workplaces, the social circles, the cultural environments that operate on the assumption of your decline were not designed with malice. They were designed for the convenience of a story, and that story needed participants. So it built environments where participation felt like the only reasonable option. You need to look very honestly. You need to look very honestly without sentimentality at which environments in your life are built around the myth and which are built around the truth. Which rooms reward energy and dismiss experience. Which relationships subtly redirect your ambition toward more appropriate channels. Which conversations end with you feeling slightly smaller than when they began. This is not about cutting people off. It is about understanding which environments cost you energy and which ones return it. You have a limited amount of a non-renewable resource, not because you are old, but because everyone has a limited amount of time at every age. And the runes you choose to inhabit determine the quality of what that time produces. The audit is simple. After each significant interaction, track the direction. Did that leave you more or less like the person you're trying to become? Over time, the pattern will be obvious. And once it's obvious, you will have to make decisions that may be uncomfortable. Make them anyway. Discomfort now is considerably cheaper than regret at 80. The next time someone, directly or through implication, suggests that your ambitions exceed your appropriate allocation, you don't need to argue. You don't need to defend. Argument concedes that the premise deserves engagement. Defense concedes that you have something to justify. 2 sentences. Internal. Not spoken aloud, held. Ready. First. They are giving me a map of their own limitations and calling it advice. Second, I don't live there. That's I-T. Not aggressive, not defensive. Certain. The certainty of someone who examined the premise, found it inapplicable, and moved on. The Joker never argues with a man who believes the world is flat. There is nothing to argue about. There is only the awareness that he's looking at the same sky you are and seeing something completely different. This is the last one, and it is the most important. So I want you to read it slowly. At some point, probably not today, possibly not this year, you will reach a moment where the decision becomes clear. Not dramatic, not announced, just clear. The moment where you stop waiting for permission to take your own potential seriously. Where the accumulated evidence of your own capacity finally outweighs the accumulated weight of the story you were handed. That moment is not a revelation. It doesn't arrive with light and music. It arrives quietly. The way all the important things do as a small, almost undramatic decision. The decision to proceed. To build the thing. Start the chapter. Make the call. Apply for the position. Begin the work. Not because the timing is perfect. The timing is never perfect. And anyone who has waited for perfect timing has been waiting for something that doesn't exist. But because the work matters and you are ready, and the only thing that has ever actually stood between you and the life you intended was the story you accepted without sufficient scrutiny. The ownership statement is not a declaration to the world. You don't say it to anyone. You say it once quietly, inside the only place it has ever mattered. I am not in decline. I am in preparation. And I am finished waiting for someone else to announce that the preparation is complete. That is the mental posture, not pride, not performance, not the embarrassing theater of self-affirmation in front of a bathroom mirror. Just the quiet, immovable decision of someone who looked at the evidence, the real evidence, the evidence of their own life, and arrived at a conclusion the story never offered them. Here is a larger pattern. The one underneath everything we've discussed. The one that the specific conversation about age is just a small example of. The world has a very efficient system for managing people who might otherwise become inconvenient. It doesn't need force. Force is expensive, and it creates resistance. What it needs is a story, a good story. A story that feels true, because everyone around you has accepted it. A story that feels kind, because it arrives in the language of compassion and realism and concern for your well-being. A story so thoroughly embedded in the culture that questioning it feels not like critical thinking, but like delusion. The story about age is one of those stories, and so is the story about what you're allowed to want. And the story about what kind of person gets to matter and at what point in their life and under what circumstances. These stories were not written for you. They were written for the system, for the smooth operation of something that runs better when you know your place and stay in it. You are at a point in your life where you have, for possibly the first time, the actual capacity to see through those stories. Not because you're older, but because you paid enough and lost enough and endured enough to have earned the particular kind of vision that only comes from real experience. You have looked at enough promises that didn't hold and enough fears that didn't materialize to know at a cellular level, which things are real and which things are theater. That is an almost terrifying amount of power. And the system, the story, is very, very aware of that. Which is why the volume on decline gets louder precisely when you are most capable of ignoring it. Precisely when you are staying at the threshold of something the story never scheduled for you. What you are right now, this person, at this age, with this particular set of scars and tools and hard-won clarity, is not a diminished version of who you were. You are the most dangerous version, because you are no longer guessing, because you are no longer performing, because you no longer need the approval of people who are still guessing and still performing, and that freedom, real freedom, not the performed kind, is the most powerful state a human being can occupy. The second half of life is not the decline. It is the arrival. And the only question that has ever actually mattered, the question underneath the fear, underneath the math, underneath the quiet grief of birthday mornings, is this. Now that you're here, now that you finally have everything you need, what exactly are you going to do with it? Don't answer me. Answer yourself. In the dark, where the real answers live.